Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's webinar. These webinars are organized by the African College of Neuropsychopharmacology, and this is the third in the series, and supported by the Aga Khan University's Brain and Mind Institute, as well as the Aga Khan University as a whole. We have many partners, including the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, and other colleges as well, including CINP, the International College, where we get colleagues to come and speak to us on topical issues. So today we have Professor Kerry Ressler. Kerry Ressler is the Chief Scientific Officer and the James and Patricia Poitras Chair in Psychiatry at McLean Hospital in the US. He's also a professor in psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School and past president of the Society for Biological Psychiatry. He was previously an investigator at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. He runs a lab that focuses on translational research, bridging molecular neurobiology and animal models with human genetic research on emotion, particularly fear and anxiety disorders. He has hundreds of publications ranging from basic molecular mechanisms of fear processing to understanding how emotion is encoded in a region of the brain called the amygdala in both animal models and human patients. He's going to talk to us about how trauma affects brain function and in relation to psychosis, with some mention on how it links up with psychosis. Kerry, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Adwole, and thank you, Professor Adwole and Leonard, for the invitation and opportunity to speak to your colleagues in Africa and Kenya and at the African College of Neuropsychopharmacology. Just sharing my screen. Are you able to see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, we can see your screen and we can hear you okay.
Perfect. So I will move along and just speak up or put a note in the chat if there's any technical difficulties. So again, as Professor Adwole said, I'm Kerry. I'm from Harvard Medical School and McLean Hospital and past president of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, ACMP, and it's wonderful to collaborate with the Africa College. I'm going to talk about our own work and work of the field today on the effects of trauma on the brain. I'll do a bit of an overview on post-traumatic stress disorder broadly. I'll do an overview of some of the neuroscience and some direct findings and summary findings for what we understand about trauma effects on the brain, and particularly related to PTSD. But then we'll spend the second half of the talk focusing on some of the newer evidence that trauma affects sensory systems, both during development but during adulthood. And some of those sensory systems may help explain some of trauma associations with psychosis, including hallucinations and delusions. And it may take us into an interesting new area of understanding some of potentially the preventable components of the effects of the environment on psychosis and other trauma-related syndromes. So with that, let me get started. First of all, just to remind us that trauma is severe mental illness, which includes trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, and certainly psychotic disorders, are considered, really the top major causes of disability worldwide. And this is work from the Global Burden of Disease, the World Economic Forum, and a number of other studies. And much of this work is primarily Western European, but work from Africa is very similar, showing that mental illness is one of the leading causes of daily disability-adjusted life years and with disability overall. And that suicide, which is one of the most morbid outcomes of our psychiatric disorders, is a very high risk of death. And certainly in young people, suicide is among the top risk of death. Other work, this is from the Health Affairs, the WHO and others, suggests that mental disorders, again, are one of the top risk factors in terms of cost of overall global spending. And Sandreo Galea, the dean of the BU Public School of Health, has stated before that trauma is a foundational driver of the health of the public. And while we often think about trauma with relationship to post-traumatic stress disorder, we know that trauma, particularly childhood trauma, and adversity that is additive over the lifespan, are one of the biggest risk factors for all psychiatric disorders. And in this case, this just shows work from Ron Kessler, the National Comorbidity Study in the US, that PTSD, formally diagnosed, is highly, highly comorbid with many of our other psychiatric disorders, including depression, a range of psychiatric disorders, and substance abuse across both males and females. What is less talked about, but I'll talk about at the end of my talk today, is the overlap of trauma with psychotic disorders. To have us all on the same page about post-traumatic stress and trauma, I'll just do a brief overview of the diagnosis and the epidemiology. First of all, PTSD is clinically important and prevalent. In the National Comorbidity Study in the US and Europe, about 5 to 10% of the population has a lifetime prevalence, but what's critical is that those who are at high risk of trauma, both war veterans, those from war-torn countries, and people living in high trauma and high-risk locations can have up to 15 to 25% risk of PTSD over their lifetime. So it can be very common. It's also important to note that in terms of the diagnosis, the first month after a trauma, we don't diagnose PTSD. Rather, the same symptoms are considered acute stress disorder. And the reason this is, and I'll talk more about it, is that most people in the immediate aftermath of trauma have a period of symptoms that looks very much like it. They may feel numb, they may feel very avoidant, they may have difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping, very, very hyper aroused. But again, most people, 80 to 90% of people after a given trauma will recover and will be basically fine, but will have a bad memory. Instead, that about 5 to 10% of the people after any given trauma go on to develop PTSD and then chronic PTSD, which we define as ongoing symptoms at 1 month or 3 months later. To formally diagnose PTSD with the DSM-5 criteria, and there's some shifts with ICD-10 and 11. We're not going to go into nosology much today because they capture all the same concepts. Is first one has to have experienced a severe life-threatening trauma. And while that is not explicitly talked about in DSM, critical for understanding the biology and the clinical component is this sense of intense fear, helplessness, and lack of safety that goes along with that severe life-threatening trauma or sexual violence. In the aftermath of trauma, again, for the first month for acute stress disorder and after 1 month for PTSD, one has to have 4 sets of symptoms. Severe and ongoing re-experiencing, and this is where we often think of the nightmares, one waking up in the middle of the night, re-experiencing, remembering those traumas, but it's not just a general memory that's random, it's a dream. It's a very specific memory and dream around that, reliving that trauma. And flashbacks that can come also co-experience with dissociation, where one really feels like one is reliving the trauma. The next set of symptoms is avoidance, and avoidance is critical for all anxiety disorders. And what we see, of course, is we naturally evolve when we're afraid of something to avoid it. That is, of course, a safety behavior, that is a survival behavior. But we also know, based on our understanding of exposure therapy and extinction and recovery from fear-related disorders, that if you avoid, you can't extinguish, you can't recover. And so avoidance is often both feels to the patient like something that they have to do, but we know can get in the way of both recovery and can be critical to disability. Not being able to be in the car, or go to work, or get out of the house, of course, gets in the way of one's ongoing function, as well as social interactions. And then the other component of social interactions is that's one of the components that's most important for recovery is positive social support. And often people with trauma avoid social interactions, become socially anxious, socially phobic, and that gets in the way of recovery as well. Criterion D really captures both the cognitive and the emotional numbing components of PTSD. We know that when people are living in trauma, living in fear, they're not able to focus, they're not able to have executive function, they're not able to create declarative memories in the same way, and their working memory doesn't work as well. And similarly, they often just feel completely emotionally numb and shut down. And finally, criterion E is increased sympathetic arousal, hyperactivity, decreased sleep, startle, hypervigilance, irritability, and decreased concentration. And we'll go over some of these with examples as well. So that's just a brief overview of the disorder, how we diagnose it, a brief overview of current treatments. Is unfortunately relatively limited. So, broadly with treatments, we have as with most areas in psychiatric disorders, we have psychotherapies and we have medications. So, in terms of psychotherapies, there's a broad range, but most of them really come down to the core of exposure therapies. And so, prolonged exposure, primarily led by NFL and others, are all a broad range of the cognitive behavior therapies, the class of cognitive behavior therapies, including within exposure cognitive processing therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, and acceptance and commitment therapies and written exposure therapies all have components of exposure. With exposure therapy, the general concept is that the one is re-exposed to the cues and the memories that drive the trauma, that are driving the trauma memory. And so, for example, if one is going to the therapist and talking about their trauma the very first time, they may have a very high level of anxiety when they're talking about the trauma. But if they keep talking about it and stay there and are working with the therapist, that anxiety will decrease over time. And then the next time they come back and talk about that same trauma, again, they may not want to, but if they start, they'll find that it's not quite as bad. And then the next time and the next time and the next time. And this process of repetitive decreased arousal, anxiety, decreased symptoms in the presence of the trauma trigger, historically, clinically has been called desensitization or habituation. Based on learning and memory theory, we call this extinction of fear. And we'll talk more about extinction of fear later. In terms of medication treatments, again, the only FDA-approved medications for PTSD are paroxetine and sertraline in the US. So SSRIs, the classic antidepressant medications. That does not mean that there are not other medications that are very helpful. In general, most medications that we use for anxiety and depression can be helpful for symptomatic treatments of PTSD. There's certainly off-label uses of mood stabilizers, benzodiazepines, antipsychotics. All of these can have problems. We know with benzodiazepines, both the risk of tolerance and addiction, as well as the fact that they may interfere with exposure, are all important. Prazosin is very interesting in terms of actually directly blocking the adrenergic system. It's probably the one that is most directly related to our understanding of the biology, but the dosing of that can be really complex because the window between having an effective dose to really decrease the hyperarousal, improve the nightmares, and improve the intrusive symptoms is a very close dose to one that actually has effects on the cardiovascular system and can lead to orthostasis and dizziness. Importantly, there are no currently FDA-approved treatments that are based on our understanding of the neurobiology. So as a field, we have a long way to go because we have this disconnect between a lot that's now understood about the neurobiology, and yet many of the ideas and targets and treatments have not yet made it for full approved use. So the focus of our work in the field in many ways is to better use the understanding of the biology of PTSD to lead to new treatments. And the arguments are that PTSD is actually maybe one of the more tractable disorders in mental health because we have a shared understanding of the neural circuitry of fear. I'll tell you more about with the amygdala and the limbic system as sort of the hub. We know when it starts. It's one of the few disorders in psychiatry where we know by definition that it starts at the time of the trauma, and that can allow us to both understand it better and potentially to prevent it from happening in the first place, at least in the early aftermath of trauma with secondary prevention measures. And finally, it is a process of learning and memory. Unlike Alzheimer's disease, for example, where we can't form new memories, with PTSD, we tend to form an over-memory of this trauma and are unable to modulate it. So this work then we hope will lead to a new neurobiology of PTSD that can lead to novel interventions and preventions. Another component of PTSD is that it is in many ways the pinnacle of disorders related to gene by-environment interactions. We, of course, have known for many decades that everything in psychiatry and most things in medicine are not all nature or all nurture. They're not all genetic or all environment. But it is hard to study that in many cases. One could argue, for example, that lung cancer is one very clear example in medicine where you have very low likelihood of lung cancer if you don't smoke, but if you have that environmental toxin. Similarly, trauma in PTSD is the example where one may have the predispositions of the genetic or nature-based predisposition for risk for PTSD, but if one does never have that environmental external trauma, that risk of life, that intrusive trauma, one would never develop PTSD. So that provides also the ability to understand the interactions of gene by environment in a way that may be easier or more tractable than some of our other psychiatric disorders, where it's not always as clear what the environmental determinant is. In terms of the neurobiology, we understand a lot now about the neurobiology of fear and threat and survival and safety learning. And these lay very nicely onto our understanding of post-traumatic stress. Joe Ledoux, along with Mike Davis and Michael Fanzelo in the US in the 70s and 80s, laid out a lot of the basic framework for the neuroscience of fear and threat. This is an example of Ledoux showing that sensory systems first are attuned to the world in obviously a real-time way. And yet there's both rapid and slower ways in which sensory information gets to the brain's threat vigilance systems, for example, the amygdala. In this case, it shows that if someone sees a stick or a snake, that information comes first to the visual thalamus, and then from the visual thalamus to the visual cortex, to higher levels of visual cortex, up to prefrontal cortex, and finally awareness. It takes about a half a second for one to be consciously aware of what one is visually seeing due to all the synapses to get to higher order cortex. In parallel with that information, there's a very rapid projection of pre-processed visual information from the visual thalamus to the amygdala that is constantly, essentially, viewing the world in a real-time way. And so the amygdala is able to fire off information from the visual system hundreds of milliseconds before one is consciously aware of the world around us. And that is terrific for survival. But it also leads to us in a world of threats being more likely to respond in a threat-based fight or flight way to many things that end up not being snakes. Maybe they're just sticks, or maybe they're not a threatening person, but because we're sensitized, we have a sensitized amygdala. If we have a trauma history, we're more likely to respond to those cues in a traumatic way. And importantly, the amygdala, as we understand it, is highly conserved across all mammals and even most vertebrates. And so it is really both is amenable to study in preclinical models, but also it suggests that this basic survival system is really critical for most vertebrate evolution. And yet we may live in a world now in which it causes more harm than good. So to dive a little bit deeper into the amygdala, which I'll talk about as an example, but by no means is the amygdala the whole PTSD story, but it's a tractable example of what we can understand. And it also has a lot of implications now in fear-related areas of psychosis, paranoid delusions, paranoia that we'll talk about at the end. So again, this is a picture of on the upper right of the amygdala hyperactivation to fearful cues in PTSD. To dive in a little bit more, again, the amygdala lives in the temporal lobes. It's constantly modulated by the hippocampus, which is regulating the contextual information, the declarative information around us, and the prefrontal cortex, which is really giving us top-down sensory modulation. When cues, both neutral cues and aversive cues, come into the amygdala, rapid events are occurring at the time of a trauma. And this essentially can be modeled with fear learning and Pavlovian fear learning. And when the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are paired, the neutral car and the car crash, a neutral person's face and being physically attacked, synaptic plasticity events, neuronal changes occur in the amygdala so that in the future, the previously neutral cue by itself is sufficient to activate the same hardwired pathway that previously the aversive system did. You can think of it as a switch in which these neutral cues that all have access to the amygdala, if they were paired with trauma, now have the ability by themselves to activate those same systems as if the crash had occurred or they had been attacked. And when that happens, we know that hardwired projections from the amygdala to many brainstem and subcortical regions lead to all of the symptoms that we see in a panic attack or a flashback: the increased heart rate, the stomach upset, the respiratory upset, being aroused, being hypervigilant, increased startle, having difficulty with social interactions, avoidance, and the hypothalamic pituitary stress axis. So a lot is understood about the basic biology here. And the question is now, what's upstream of that? Why, after a trauma, do most people recover, but about 10% of people have ongoing symptoms and they're not able to modulate this cue dependency, and they are more likely to be hypersensitive to trauma? So we think about fear disorders along a spectrum. I just told you a little bit about the basic biology of what's happening in the limbic system, the amygdala, the hippocampus. But again, the bigger question is, why after a trauma? Traumas are very prevalent, and in at-risk communities, 90%, 95% of people can experience a severe trauma in their lifetime. But why only 10% of people develop PTSD? Well, part of it is pre-existing sensitivity. I'll talk a little bit about genetics. And again, we think about 40% of risk for later PTSD may be in part genetically modulated. And that's similar risk as we see with addiction or with depression and anxiety. And again, early environment. Childhood trauma is one of the biggest risk factors for PTSD and for all psychiatric disorders. Is early childhood trauma sensitizing these stress and fear and threat systems to make them more likely to develop PTSD later in life? At the time of learning of fear and consolidation of fear, it's critical to know that memories aren't created immediately. Rather, they're made permanent over minutes to hours to days and maybe even weeks. And there may be very different biological events that happen that predispose someone to PTSD versus recovery, as well as what's happening in the environment. What are their social supports? Are they in an ongoing threatened situation versus do they feel safe? How does sleep modulate this? How do other components modulate this? So that's all areas of a very active study, with the hope that by understanding early memory consolidation, we could prevent PTSD from developing in the first place. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. And then finally, once the symptoms start to sort of set in, the intrusive memories, the nightmares, the flashbacks, in these early days and weeks of acute stress disorder, those who have PTSD are more likely to generalize the cues, to generalize more and more and more threats. They're more likely to be increasingly sensitized to respond and startle more. Those who recover are more likely to discriminate those cues. Fear and safety occur in different places and are at different risk. And they're more likely to have natural extinction. When they talk about the trauma to their families, they feel less and less hyper aroused over time. So if we can find ways to enhance discrimination and extinction and to diminish generalization and sensitization, we can also decrease the ongoing effects of trauma on PTSD. So in the remaining time, I'll talk a little bit more about translational studies of memory consolidation that further implicate the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the other systems modulating memory. I'll also tell you a little bit about where the field is with large-scale genetics that's really helping point to new targets for PTSD, as well as help validate older targets like in the stress HPA axis system. I'll then shift gears and talk more about what we know about how threat, both in animal models and humans, how traumas may alter sensory modulation or sensory circuit, both at a structural level and a functional level, and how that may then implicate some of these sensory systems for trauma-related psychosis and may help explain some of the associations that have been seen in both developmental childhood trauma and in adult trauma in increased risk for schizophrenia and other psychosis-like syndromes. So in terms of early trauma, so again, I mentioned that memories aren't formed immediately, rather they become permanent over time. And this is an example of what really worked from decades from people like Jim McGaugh and Donald Hebb and many others more recently, including Eric Kandel and others, in terms of understanding the basic ideas of short-term memories being consolidated to long-term memories. The idea is that initially a memory is just living in sort of working memory and in a short-term way and is not permanent. It is, however, consolidated over minutes to hours to days into long-term memory. When that long-term memory is reactivated, it may be reconsolidated, and we can talk in the discussion about some of the science of reconsolidation but we think this element also may help to sensitize that memory for those who go on to develop PTSD. Those who recover are more likely to extinguish over time. But one thing we would really like to understand, if we could understand this initial process of memory consolidation, could we actually interfere with trauma development in the first place? And one set of studies that I've been involved in over the last 10 years was initially at Emory Hospital and Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami. And then that work from that helped lead to a large-scale study in the US called the Aurora study, which is about longitudinal assessment of PTSD syndromes. In both of these, we identified people in emergency departments shortly after trauma. Mostly these were car crashes or motor vehicle crashes. And then we followed them up for up to a year. They had the best modern technology we could provide in terms of wearable digital devices, active and passive data on phones, and we brought them back in for neuroimaging scanning at 2 weeks and 6 months. A lot of the data is still being analyzed, and we're starting to also use these data to better understand the intersection of PTSD and traumatic brain injury. But just a few examples of the kind of data coming out of this. A lot of the imaging has been led by Jenny Stevens at Emory and Nate Harnett at McLean. And what Jenny and colleagues found was early in the aftermath of trauma, even just a few weeks after trauma, when we still call the disorder acute stress as opposed to PTSD, people's level of activation, this is functional magnetic resonance imaging in a scanner, while looking at fearful versus neutral faces. When they saw fearful faces, we know in chronic PTSD, fearful faces are more like, well, any face is more likely to activate the amygdala in PTSD, but particularly fearful faces. And we saw that early activation of fearful faces predicted PTSD 3 months and 12 months later quite robustly. So one of the findings is this basic circuitry of hyperamygdala activation is associated early on after trauma with later PTSD. In contrast, data over the years has suggested that hippocampal functioning and medial prefrontal functioning has tend to have the opposite valence as the amygdala. Their activation tends to downregulate amygdala and seems to contextualize or provide safety signals. So that less hippocampal activation to hippocampal cues, in this case, response inhibition tasks, is generally associated with more PTSD. And Sana Van Ruij found this as well, that 2 weeks after the trauma, low levels of hippocampal activation to an inhibition task were associated with much more PTSD symptoms at 3 months and 6 months later, whereas high levels of hippocampal activation, high levels of hippocampal functioning with declarative memory, with response inhibition, et cetera, were associated with lower PTSD. And finally, peripheral measures of sympathetic activation, the noradrenergic response, for example, are associated with much more PTSD symptoms early in the aftermath of trauma. And this is just using galvanic skin response for essentially sweat measures, asking people what brought them into the emergency room. And we found that those who had high levels of early activation, sympathetic activation, to this essentially neutral open question was much more predictive of PTSD 6 months later. So this kind of work is all working towards helping to better predict what are the risk factors for those who will develop PTSD and not. Today, I'm not talking about as much of our preclinical work on novel treatments, but just to say that there's both a number of examples like hydrocortisone that have been studied in the literature, and many other new targets that are coming down, the adenosine receptor, the neurotensin receptor, the tachykinin receptor, that look like they're involved in early trauma consolidation. And these and others suggest that if we could find the right tools for manipulating consolidation, and we had the right biological or physiological ways of predicting who is more likely to develop PTSD 6 months or 12 months later, we could do the same thing in the emergency department for PTSD that we now do for a heart attack or a stroke. If we had those early symptoms, we had early predictors, and we knew the right drugs for the right patients, we could prevent the development of PTSD. I want to shift gears and talk about another cohort. So I just talked about the Aurora cohort, trying to understand the development of PTSD and some of the ongoing work there. Other work we've been doing is cross-sectional understanding community violence and community rates of PTSD. And this has been going on for almost 20 years now, starting in Atlanta at the Grady Memorial Hospital. And since this time, we've interviewed over 13,000, I think close to 15,000 now, folks from inner city Atlanta. And this is a primarily about 90% African-American population, Black American population, about 5% Hispanic, and about 5% Asian and Caucasian. Importantly, this is a part of Atlanta that is particularly financially impoverished. And so the vast majority of people coming for care live below the American poverty line. And they have extraordinarily high rates of trauma exposure. Almost 50% know somebody personally in their lifetime who had been murdered. Almost a half had been attacked, and high rates of sexual assault and trauma. And so this is one of the larger studies of at-risk communities in America. And in addition to being a cohort for which we've learned a lot about the neurobiology, have replicated some of the findings I just showed you with amygdala activation, with hippocampal D and prefrontal cortex deactivation. It's also been one of the cohorts that's started the Psychiatric Genomic Consortium for understanding the genetics of risk and environment for PTSD. Importantly, while I'm not going to talk much about it today, a number of our collaborators, particularly Nagar Fani, Nate Harnett, and Sierra Carter, have led studies to also understand how this at-risk community can help us to understand the effects of lifetime trauma, and particularly the effects of racial discrimination and ongoing negative life experiences in trauma-exposed Black populations. And so this is really leading work in the US to help understand the effects of structural racism and ongoing chronic stressors, in part due to structural racism, chronic poverty, and discrimination effects on then sensitizing these amygdala and threat systems for the effects of later trauma as well. I'm happy to talk more about this in the discussion. But as I mentioned, the Grady Trauma Project was also one of the founding cohorts, along with Kirsten Conan's work with the Nurses' Health Study, Caroline Nievergelt's work with the Marine Resilience Study, and many others, of the Psychiatric Genomic Consortium for PTSD. And I'm not going to talk much about it today either, but Kirsten Conan's also leading an Africa PTSD genetics consortia to really expand, because we know that that linkage disequilibrium is really quite different across the different U.S. continental populations. And if we don't, and we need more African representation in our genomics to better understand the linkage disequilibrium. But nonetheless, in these cohorts that right now are primarily Western and European, we now have over 1 million participants total, with about 200,000 cases for PTSD. And importantly, the genetics of PTSD is almost as robust now as the genetics of bipolar or schizophrenia. This latest study in Nature Genetics, out 2 months ago, shows almost 100 loci with many different interesting genes. And as I talk about later, quite a few of these interesting genes are also overlapping with some of the schizophrenia risk genes when we think about comorbidity. Again, some of these genes are across, in different loci across the chromosomes, but I want to focus on two populations of these genes. One is a number of genes related to glutamatergic function and synaptic plasticity, which is really important given our understanding of the role of learning and memory and plasticity in PTSD, both in developing PTSD as well as in the failure to recover. But another set of genes that are quite exciting are those that are involved in the stress pathways and hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is, of course, exciting because it's sort of a convergence or validation of human genetics with our biological understanding of the neurocircuitry. And one of those clusters on chromosome 17 includes the gene for the corticotropin-releasing hormone receptor. This is CRH receptor. This is a large set of loci, but a number of the polymorphisms that are genome-wide significant are also expression-linked QTL, so EQTLs for the CRH gene regulating CRH release. And it's important to know that at a common variant level, none of these have strong predictive value, but they point to biology that is really interesting. And to remind you, the CRH gene is really the top of the classic stress axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal stress axis. CRH release causes ACTH release from the pituitary, causing cortisol release from the adrenal gland. And importantly, amygdala activation of CRH is one of the primary drivers of hypothalamic release of CRH. And just to briefly show you work that's now decades old, is that there has been a long association of CRF or CRH, two different acronyms for the same gene, relationships to PTSD in humans, from cerebrospinal fluid to hyperactivation of the HPA axis, but also in animal models. If we overexpress CRF or CRH within the rodent amygdala, we get increased startle and increased fear-related behaviors. If we overactivate the CRF neurons by disinhibiting GABA on the CRF neurons, we get an increased fear, we get a deficit in extinction of fear, and an inability to recover from the fear response, as well as a hyperactivation of the HPA axis. So many of the biological syndromes that we see within PTSD, we can replicate by overactivating the HPA axis at the level of CRF or CRH. And another regulator, importantly, of the CRH axis is the glucocorticoid receptor itself. And one of the main regulators of the glucocorticoid receptor is a gene called FKBP5, which serves as a chaperone within the nuclei for regulating glucocorticoid response. And I'm not going to go into the biology, but just to say there's been a lot of data over the years that FKBP5 differential modulation is associated with the relationship between child abuse and PTSD, that FKBP5 modulation is associated with increased amygdala activation, decreased hippocampal function, and that epigenetics of FKBP5 may be part of the story for understanding the stress response pathways. So to wrap up this part of the study of the talk, I want to just sort of summarize sort of a simplistic hypothesis that we have that I think helps explain some of understanding differential sensitivity and how gene and environment may together interact at the level of these circuits. So again, the amygdala, overly simplified, but the amygdala sort of representing the limbic response system, is constantly modulated to be able to take external sensory cues, compare them to internal memories, and rapidly, in a pre-conscious way, again, in 100 milliseconds compared to 500 milliseconds that it takes to be consciously aware, activate the stress response system, or instead say, no, this is not a threat. This is a stick and not a snake. We can be tolerant. And it's constantly modulated by cortical regions, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. And this is all necessary. And the part of the system develops through a sufficiently supportive, nurturing, and safe developmental environment. And a lot of work by Regina Sullivan and many other people have talked about development of the amygdala over time. Work by Regina Sullivan, Francis Lee, and others have shown that developmental cortisol can alter amygdala development and can make amygdala develop more rapidly. And we know that FKBP5, again, this gene that's involved in cortisol sensitivity, is critical perhaps for amygdala development and early life stress. Such that early life stress combined with increased cortisol in the presence of genetic risks such as FKBP5, perhaps CRHR1 and others, may lead to an amygdala that is more that responds in a more sensitive, stressful, fearful way. And so what it suggests is that a combination of life risk factors, childhood maltreatment, poverty, violence exposure, experienced racism, etc., combined with biological risk factors, for example, genetics that increase HPA stress sensitivity, could all lead to an amygdala that is now hypersensitive during development, so that when an adult trauma occurs, one may then be more likely to develop the primed stress responsive pathway of an overactive amygdala that cannot be modulated as well, leading to higher risk for PTSD and trauma syndromes. So this is more of a working hypothesis by far than it is fact, but I think it's one for which a lot of the data are starting to help us better understand the effects of gene and environment on stress responsiveness. I want to shift gears for the last bit to talk about beyond the amygdala. So again, we have known in the field of sensory neuroscience for a long time that developmental effects on sensory systems can lead to altered structure. So, for example, Hubel and Wiesel showed that if you, during development, block one eye, one can end up having lifetime blindness because the cortical development doesn't occur. It was long thought that many of the sensory systems are permanent after early developments, and in adulthood, there is no structural change. However, there's a lot of data that is actually not the case. And I want to show a little bit of data on fear in preclinical fear conditioning trauma models in the in the olfactory system, the auditory system, showing you can get structural change in adult animals with sensory related trauma. And then in human data, that visual trauma exposure may alter visual cortex. And it raises the question of, do we get sensory processing training after trauma exposure? And from a PTSD perspective, this also raises questions about people's work like Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a famous book called The Body Keeps Score. And his point is that trauma and PTSD is not just the trauma memory, it's not just the trauma response, but it's a memory that feels like it's through the whole body that was involved with the trauma. And our data on sensory systems may suggest a neural way that the trauma is being encoded in addition. So early on after, in our work looking at amygdala, so on these figures on the bottom, we were looking at in about 2000 in Michael Davis's lab, sensory plasticity in amygdala following tone shock pairing. And we saw plenty of plasticity in the amygdala, but importantly, we saw it in many other brain regions, including the auditory system and other sensory areas. Orion Kiefer, an MD PhD student in my lab, went on to show that there's structural change in the auditory cortex with tone shock pairing. So he did 10 days of tone shock pairing. So this is quite robust, much more robust fear conditioning than we would normally do. We're essentially overlearning, but it's all within an adult animal, and it's 10 tone shock training trials. Then he did voxel-based morphometry in a high-resolution 9.4T magnet. And what he saw was increased gray matter density after 2 weeks after this fear training in a number of limbic regions like the insula, the amygdala, but importantly also in the auditory cortex, suggesting that there was more gray matter density in those regions. And so he went on to say what was going on underlying the gray matter density in the auditory cortex with auditory fear conditioning or auditory trauma. And what he found is the same brain regions that showed increased gray matter density showed significantly more spines when using a fluorescent driver of pyramidal neurons after fear conditioning than did controls. And with shoal analysis could shift the density of those, show a shift in the density of those spines. Again, all adult animals showing increased structural representation of that auditory cortex after tone shock pairing. And these increased spines accounted for a significant percent of the increased gray matter density seen with voxel-based morphometry and imaging. Other work in our lab by Nina Banerjee showed that perineuronal nets, which were thought to be relatively developmentally modulated and not changing in adulthood, these are networks of proteoglycans that surround synapses. She, in fact, shown rapid changes in those neuronal nets in the same auditory cortex region in the aftermath of auditory fear conditioning that then normalized 24 hours later, suggesting at least a structural potential way that more synapses could be created. So those are just a few of the many examples in the auditory cortex of how we can get structural change in auditory cortex after auditory fear learning. In the olfactory bulb, we've also shown that there can be very significant structural changes in the olfactory bulb in adult animals with olfactory fear condition. To remind you, there's about 1,000 odorant receptor genes in the nose, and each of those projects to the olfactory bulb, and all of the neurons in the nose that express the same odorant receptor converge in their projectin to a specific place in the olfactory bulb. And what that looks like is if you have a reporter, in this case, it's a Z, so we could make the axons blue. These are all the axons coming in from the nose to the glomerulus that represent a specific receptor called M71, and it responds to an odor called acetophenone that smells kind of like cherry. If you now take these same animals and you do olfactory fear condition and expose them over and over again to this cherry-like odor with shock, and then test them again as an adult, you get this remarkable increased representation of both the number of neurons in the nose and the axons in the bulb, increasing this olfactory sensitivity to that specific odor. And we've shown that in multiple ways and have shown that it both is maintained for up to 6 weeks. But if you extinguish those animals and now diminish the salience of that particular odor so that they do not care about that odor anymore, they normalize the number of neurons and the density of axons in the olfactory bulb to that odor. And I didn't mention, but we showed that if you train them to a different odor, you don't see this. So it's odor-specific increases. And we think this may also explain some effects of trauma on multiple sensitivity syndromes. So that's an example of the olfactory system and the auditory system in mice related to trauma cues. Nate Harnett in our group has shown in multiple groups studies in humans now that there may be really robust changes in affective visual circuitry in trauma with trauma. So he's been studying the visual system, and he noticed in a lot of our data, and a lot of people ignore the effects, the activation of the visual system in trauma. And critically, he did what's called multimodal imaging, looking at gray matter volume, peel surface area, cortical thickness, as well as diffusion tensor imaging. And across these, see over and over again, this is our first in our work based at Grady Memorial Hospital, that structural differences in visual cortex accounted for quite a bit of the increased risk of PTSD symptoms that we saw following trauma. Suggesting that something about the visual system was either changing after a visual-related trauma, again, these are mostly car crashes, or something about the visual system structural differences was associated with different risk for PTSD. He then replicated this in the Aurora study, again, across about 15 different emergency departments, again, showing these very robust effects of structural peel surface area, gray matter volume, and fractional anisotropy of the visual cortex on PCL5 symptoms in PTSD. And interestingly, they saw that these structural covariance networks in the visual system were associated with nightmare frequency, nightmare intensity, and nightmare severity of intrusive nightmares. Again, the visual component of intrusive nightmares. And finally, they showed that differential connectivity of the amygdala and hippocampal resting state network with visual system was associated with increased PTSD symptoms. So again, in humans, finding that the visual system, of course, we're often thought of as primarily a visual animal, that both structural alterations in the visual cortex and connections between the amygdala system and the visual cortex were associated with much of the PTSD symptoms seen in people with highly visual traumas like a car crash. So in summary, neural processing and sensory systems likely represents a critical component of sensory-specific threat encoding. When we learn a threat memory, we usually talk about what's happening down at the limbic system, the amygdala. We're now realizing that much of the sensory inputs coming in from the very first sensory systems, like the olfactory bulb, likely the thalamus, certainly the higher order auditory cortex and visual cortex, all of these are also undergoing plasticity and may undergo structural change that may help underlie pervasive components of sensory intrusive memory, sensory triggers, and sensory-related nightmares in people with PTSD. Leading to my last question, what about trauma-related psychosis symptoms? So this is work from Adamson and Shevlin and colleagues from 2007, so almost 20 years ago. And over 10,000 people from the National Comorbidity Study and the British Psychiatric Morbidity Study. And they looked at the association of multiple comorbidities and lifetime and other potential risk factors for psychotic disorders, with predicting psychosis on DSM being the primary outcome. They found a number of things we've seen before, that male sex is more associated, lower education is associated, lower incomes associated, urbanicity, but critically, they talked about trauma. So no trauma, people experiencing no traumas or one trauma. And again, most of our work in trauma, we look at very low levels of trauma, often with 0 to 2, and then high levels of trauma. Those no traumas or one trauma had no increased risk of psychosis. But increased rates of trauma had a really stair-stepped level of increased rates of psychotic diagnoses. And when you got up to multiple traumas, like 5 traumas, those were remarkable increases. So, 30 or over 100-fold increase. So there's something that's been known for a long time about trauma association with PTSD. As a clinician myself, I saw some people who had what appeared to be very refractory schizophrenia, and yet there seemed to be an underlying trauma component that we couldn't quite get at. Again, schizophrenia, like all other psychiatric diseases, multiple things. There is no question that there are many primary psychotic disorders that likely have nothing to do with trauma, but there may be a subset of psychotic disorders that have an underlying trauma component that we're not paying attention to. In our own work, again, back in Atlanta, this led by Abby Powers and Beck Bradley, they found an overall association with childhood trauma and psychotic symptoms in adulthood. And this is a well-replicated finding. But again, in our own data set of about 500 people, 400 people, PTSD, depression, and substance abuse were all much more associated with trauma, so with psychosis. So again, there's more, where there's comorbidity, there's comorbidity. But critically, with this study, they were able to show mediation. If you accounted for PTSD from childhood trauma, that took all of the significance away from child abuse and psychosis. And instead, it was essentially untreated PTSD symptoms that was accounting for the difference between the association between childhood abuse and current psychosis. In this very interesting analysis by Stefan Potvin and others in 2019 in American Journal of Psychiatry, they meta-analyzed 23 studies in schizophrenia patients compared to controls, and looked at brain activity looking at neutral stimuli. And the overall effect was that in schizophrenia patients relative to healthy control, increased activation was seen in left and right amygdala and the hippocampal gyrus and other areas in response to neutral stimuli. And their conclusion was that given that multiple limbic regions were more activated in these threat responsive regions, it suggests that patients confer aberrant emotional significance to non-threatening stimuli, and may underlie delusional symptoms in a subset of people with PTSD. Daphne Holt at MGH has shown that amygdala dysregulation is associated with persecutory beliefs and more paranoid beliefs. And finally, that failure responding to safety cues, recovery from extinction, is seen in schizophrenia. So they found in schizophrenia compared to control, they had a deficit in extinction. They were not able to recover from fear cues in a laboratory setting as well. And that controls were more likely to activate the medial prefrontal cortex in extinction that we know is involved in top-down regulation, whereas schizophrenia were more likely to activate visual cortex, coming back to some of the visual data we've been talking about. And the last slide I'll show is this work by Ann Shin at McLean Hospital with Melissa Kaufman, where they're looking at auditory cortex in people who hear voices. So they're changed, rather than saying auditory hallucinations, they're just saying voice hearing. And it's across a range of both schizophrenia, primary schizophrenia diagnosis versus primary PTSD diagnosis with dissociation in people who hear voices. And they're often the traumatic voices of people who were attacked them. And again, what they see is connections between the auditory cortex, particularly the inferior temporal gyrus, and other regions associated with voice hearing, as able to be predictive of their likelihood of reporting voice hearing in a transdiagnostic way across trauma and psychotic disorders. So I want to end with saying PTSD is both complex but also tractable, and it's not one thing, but it's something that occurs over time. I talked a little bit about how we understand memory consolidation and some of the new data on large-scale genetics, and how some of that data is starting to validate our long-held understanding of the role of stress and stress genes with trauma modulation, and how those stress modulatory pathways may sensitize the amygdala for later threat responding in PTSD. But I also talked about it, not just the amygdala, it's the information coming into the amygdala. And trauma may sensitize the sensory circuits as well, so that both the sensory information coming in and the amygdala are all more sensitive to future trauma cues. And finally, that there may be an overlap between psychotic syndromes, and that we need to look for trauma histories in some people with psychosis, because there's intriguing biological overlap in the amygdala, the threat systems, persecutory beliefs, and delusion, and possibly delusions, as well as in some of the sensory systems changing. So with that, I think due to time, I will stop and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Kerry, for the very, very elaborate explanation that eventually ties up trauma exposure, post-traumatic stress disorder, what's happening in the brain, and potential links with psychosis. So there are a few questions that are in the Q&A. I'll just sample a few in the interest of time and then have you answer them. The first one is about, so there's somebody who says they have understood from the explanation that repeated trauma is more likely to cause PTSD, and they would like to understand whether there are other people who develop PTSD after only one trauma exposure. So you will probably address that as well. There's a question around trauma and its related memory, because we have talked about memory formation, consolidation, retrieval, and sometimes somebody forgets memories. And so what about memories related to trauma? Is it possible for somebody to forget about those as well?
Yeah. So let me maybe answer those before you go too much further. I can only hold so much.
Absolutely. Okay.
So I think the first question is, what is this disconnect between some people who may have multiple traumas and not develop PTSD, or only develop PTSD after the 5th or 6th trauma, and other people develop PTSD after only a single trauma? We think of this as really kind of the crux of the gene by environment question, that everybody, whether it be addiction, for some people, they can have multiple drinks every day and never really have an addiction to alcohol, and others, after 1 or 2 drinks, they want more and more. So there's likely a biological predisposition, and that biology may be partly genetics, and it may be partly what their own history has brought to present, whether it be genetics, changing in circuits and others, so that they're biologically more at risk with a single trauma than others that may need multiple traumas. On that risk curve, most people are susceptible if you have enough trauma. I think and then the other question is, what about people who seem to not be able to remember the trauma? There's this long history of distorted narratives, or feeling like parts of the trauma are not clear. And we think this has to do with the hippocampal dysfunction in the peritraumatic time, that working memory doesn't work as well, and that trauma memories are so emotionally activating that they kind of shut down the brain, and that's partly what the dissociation process is. And likely some of the disjointed narratives, the difficulty to remember some specific components of trauma versus others, is probably a component of dissociation, shutting down working memory when that emotional trigger is too strong.
Yeah. So there's an interesting question here, that we have shown the changes that happen in the brain and in the neurocircuitry as a result of trauma exposure, resulting in PTSD and related syndromes. How does psychotherapy change this? This is what Syed is asking. How does psychotherapy and other therapeutic interventions then change that circuitry?
The true answer is we don't fully know. Some of the data would suggest that with psychotherapy, there is better ability of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex to have top-down regulation of the amygdala. So essentially, we're retraining the brain for safety. But to do that, it takes a combination of overcoming the tendency of wanting to escape, wanting to fight or flight, doing what the amygdala wants to do, and letting instead the amygdala be vulnerable to this information from the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, to retrain the amygdala that in this case, in this conversation, sitting in this chair, you're not being attacked, even though having the memory is not the same as re-experiencing it. And that essentially is what the brain has to learn.
Yeah. Very interesting. So Osama asks, if a client is diagnosed with schizophrenia with underlying stressors as well, does treating the underlying stressors help them recover from schizophrenia based on these linkages that we're starting to find? That's an interesting one.
Absolutely. I think lots of evidence from sort of the social supports, the community involvement in some of the CBT therapies for schizophrenia suggest that we can decrease underlying stressors, we can decrease psychosis. We know that stress is a risk for psychosis everywhere. I think the more critical, another question is if we could treat the underlying PTSD for people who have comorbid PTSD and schizophrenia. So I think somewhere in the question and answer was someone said, so is all schizophrenia from PTSD? Absolutely not. Please don't take that from here. There are many disorders. There's probably any person with schizophrenia may have one of 100 different things going on. We call it all schizophrenia. There are going to be some that are very clearly genetic syndromes that are very clearly, metabolic issues and other things unrelated to trauma. But there is likely a reasonable percent of psychosis that we see that is related to trauma that is not yet treated. That said, because exposure therapy, it can be very upsetting, I would not recommend taking someone who's actively psychotic and immediately doing classic exposure therapy. One has to do the right kind of work. It may be EMDR, it may be something that's not exactly the same as talking about the trauma itself, but really more about the safety and other components. So one would need to be thoughtful about how one does it, because certainly further stressing the patient's not going to help in the short term. But no question that if we can treat the underlying stress and trauma disorders, we will likely make some people with trauma-related psychosis better.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time, and Kerry has graciously given his contacts on the chat. Additional questions can be sent to him, and he will answer your emails, provide you with the responses that you need. Thank you very much, Kerry, for taking your time, taking a whole hour off your very, very busy schedule to come and speak with us. We had a huge attendance, more than 300 people at the peak, and there was robust engagement with question and answers. There are many there, and I hope that people will email you and get the responses from you.
Thank you so much, Professor Olivier. Great to see you. And yes, please email me, and I'd love to have ongoing conversation. Sorry we did not have time today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.